The Lycurgus cup changes color when light hits it, a phenomenon we now know involves quantum mechanics. But did the Romans understand the science behind their creation? Let's explore this fascinating intersection of ancient craftsmanship and modern physics. The Lycurgus cup shows off two amazing colors depending on how you look at it. Hold it up to the light, and it glows a bright ruby red, but view it in regular lighting, and it appears a mysterious green. This color-changing magic comes from tiny bits of gold and silver mixed into the glass. We're talking pieces so small they're only about 50 nanometers wide, less than 1,000th the width of a human hair. The Romans made this cup in the 4th century AD, and they managed to create what we now call a dichroic effect. While they probably didn't know exactly why it worked, they had mastered a technique that modern scientists are still impressed by. The cup shows scenes from the story of King Lycurgus, who, according to myth, tried to harm the god Dionysus and was punished for it. The Romans were surprisingly good at working with metals and glass, even if they didn't fully understand the science behind their methods. They mixed gold and silver into glass, using techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen. These artisans discovered that adding specific amounts of metals and heating them in certain ways created beautiful effects. What's amazing is that they were actually creating nanoparticles, though they had no idea that's what they were doing. They probably discovered this through trial and error, carefully noting which combinations worked best. The way they processed these materials, grinding them super fine and heating them to exact temperatures, was remarkably close to how we make nanoparticles today. Modern scientists have found that Roman glassworkers somehow figured out the perfect size for these metal particles to create their color-changing effects. Now, you might wonder if the ancient world had even more advanced scientific knowledge that was lost to time. The Library of Alexandria, that legendary center of learning in ancient Egypt, might have held secrets about these glass-making techniques. The library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and some historians think it may have had detailed records of Roman and Greek craft methods. While we shouldn't assume they had a complete understanding of quantum mechanics, they might have documented their observations about how different materials created unusual effects. The library's destruction means we'll never know for sure what technical knowledge was lost. But here's what we do know. Craftsmen of the ancient world were careful observers who kept detailed records of their work. They may not have had the scientific terms we use today, but they understood cause and effect in their craft. The Library of Alexandria could have been the missing link in understanding how they achieved such impressive results. Let's talk about a Roman poet named Lucretius, who wrote something pretty amazing. A huge poem called On the Nature of Things. This wasn't just any poem. It was all about how the world was made up of tiny particles, something like our modern idea of atoms. Lucretius believed everything was made of these invisible building blocks that could combine in different ways. He wrote that these particles moved around in space and joined together to create everything we see. What's really cool is how close this idea was to our modern understanding of atoms and molecules. Lucretius even suggested that these particles followed specific rules about how they could move and combine, kind of like our current knowledge of chemical bonds. While he didn't have microscopes or lab equipment, his careful thinking and observation led him to ideas that were way ahead of his time. The Romans didn't just show their understanding of materials in glasswork. Their buildings also reveal some surprisingly modern principles. Take the Pantheon's dome, for example. The Romans created different layers of concrete, making each layer lighter as it went up, using volcanic rock at the bottom and light pumice at the top. They also added tiny air bubbles to their concrete mix, similar to how we think about spacing between particles today. These builders were masters at understanding how materials interact at different scales. They even discovered that adding certain minerals to their concrete made it stronger, a process we now know involves chemical reactions at the molecular level. The Romans also used metal clamps between stone blocks that would expand and contract with temperature changes, showing they understood how materials behave under different conditions. Pretty impressive for people who didn't have modern physics textbooks. The Romans used some remarkable medical treatments that, unknown to them, worked because of quantum-level interactions. They used silver containers to keep water pure, which we now know works because silver ions disrupt bacterial cell membranes. Roman doctors also used copper and gold tools, noticing they helped prevent infections. Today we understand this happens because of these metals' antimicrobial properties at the atomic level. They even treated skin conditions with certain metals ground into fine powders, accidentally creating nanoparticles that could penetrate deep into tissue. One of their most effective treatments was colloidal gold, tiny particles of gold suspended in liquid, which they used to treat various ailments. Modern science has shown these treatments actually worked, though the Romans had no way of knowing they were using quantum effects to heal people. The secret to Roman concrete's incredible durability might actually connect to the same tiny-scale physics that makes the Lycurgus cup so special. Roman builders mixed volcanic ash with lime and seawater, creating a material that's lasted for 2,000 years. The magic happens at the microscopic level, where tiny crystals form and actually make the concrete stronger over time. When seawater seeps into tiny cracks, it triggers a chemical reaction that fills these gaps with new minerals. Modern scientists have found that the exact mix of materials the Romans used creates unique particle interactions, similar to how the gold and silver particles work in the Lycurgus cup. While the Romans didn't know about atoms and molecules, they had perfected a recipe that worked with nature at its smallest levels. The Romans had some fascinating ideas about light and the stars that weren't too far off from what we know today. They noticed that light behaved differently when passing through materials like glass and water, and they used this knowledge to create tools for studying the sky. Roman astronomers like Ptolemy wrote about how light travels in straight lines and bounces off surfaces in predictable ways. They built devices called armillary spheres, beautiful bronze models that tracked the movement of celestial bodies. The Romans also noticed that light from stars twinkled, while light from planets stayed steady, though they didn't know this was because of our atmosphere. They even figured out that the moon reflects the sun's light rather than producing its own, a pretty impressive observation for people working without telescopes. The Romans created some amazing military equipment that, without them knowing it, used principles we now connect to quantum mechanics. Their famous Damascus steel swords contained carbon nanotubes and nanowires, making them incredibly strong and sharp. The steel's unique patterns came from careful forging techniques passed down through generations. They also developed a special purple dye for officers' cloaks using sea snails. This dye actually changed color through a process similar to what happens in the Lycurgus cup. Their shield designs included layers of different metals that we now know created unique physical properties at the atomic level. Even their famous Roman armor polish, which protected against rust, worked because of how metal atoms interact with oxygen. The Romans might not have known the science, but they sure knew how to make their military equipment work at levels too small to see. Let's be clear about something. While the Romans were incredibly skilled craftsmen, they weren't secret quantum physicists. They created amazing things like the Lycurgus cup through careful observation and refined techniques, not because they understood the underlying science. Think of it like early photographers who could take perfect pictures without knowing how light sensors work. The Romans developed their glass-making and metalworking skills through generations of trial and error, carefully documenting what worked and what didn't. They were masters of their craft who discovered practical applications that happened to involve quantum effects, even though they couldn't explain why. This doesn't make their achievements any less impressive. In fact, it makes them even more remarkable. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient Roman innovation. The Lycurgus cup shows how discoveries can happen even without understanding the science behind them. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating piece of history, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends.